Hello and welcome to the first Dingle Podcast. Today we're going to be doing some old school wrestling reviews. This is the first episode of this. I'm very excited to get going with it. It is going to be old school WWWF from Madison Square Garden. Now, I've got a plan for these weekly podcasts that I'm going to do. Try to get them out every Wednesday. And the aim is to start off by doing old reviews of WWE pay-per-views and WWF pay-per-views, and doing every single one, and starting from 1985, going right the way through, reviewing just all of them, because why not? Yeah, lots of bad wrestling, lots of good wrestling, everything in between. Hopefully it'll be lots of fun, lots of laughs, but before we do that, we are going to start by reviewing old school Madison Square Garden shows, going back as far as we possibly can, all the way to 1973 to begin our reviews. And the first show is WWWF live from Madison Square Garden, the 30th of June 1973. It's the first full show from Madison Square Garden on the network in the old school section, and we're just going to go right into it. So let's get crack-a-lack-a-lacking. And the first match that we are going to review in this entire series, which will hopefully last a very long time, is Lee Wong versus Blackjack Lanza. Lanza. I always get confused by that, the Americans, the way they do that. Because for me, I'd say it's Blackjack Lanza. It's like the old Han Solo thing, isn't it? Because, I say Han Solo, and then in the actual movie, Daisy Ridley said Han Solo, and that made me really confused. Do English people say Han or Han? Americans say Han? I don't understand it. I don't entirely get it, but I digress. So this was the first match. Blackjack Lanza, of course, one half of the Blackjacks, along with Mulligan. Still a couple of years, I think, before they win the tag team championships. And he was against Lee Wong, who was a jobber. Billed as Lee Wong from Hong Kong. There wasn't a great deal of information that I could find about him, but he's renowned as being billed as Lee Wong from Hong Kong. But in this match, he was billed as being from Ecuador, which I found particularly strange for a guy who you would expect to have a sort of racist Chinese gimmick if you're going by traditional WWE standards, or WWWF standards from the old shows. And so the match starts, and the first thing I noticed as the show starts is, Vince McMahon Jr. is on commentary, and he's stumbling his way through it, and you can tell he's very new to it, and he's very young, and he's very inexperienced at it, but he's getting better all the time. And as I've started to go through these shows, he does get better and gets more into it. And some of the things he came out with on this show, which we will get into, do put a little bit more perspective on what the announcers are doing nowadays on Raw and SmackDown. But one of the first things I noticed was how much more legit he took it than he necessarily did when he was in charge. I think that was more sort of the restrictions put on him by his dad, who was still in charge of the company at this point. He would end up being in charge of the company for another few years. And one of the big signs of this, and the difference in how legit it was presented, as the ring announcer is announced in the first match, he immediately name drops Nat Cooper, Dick Worry, and Matt Ryder, who were the judges. And this is something that's very new to me, because as a fan who up until recently didn't go back and watch old school stuff, I didn't necessarily know that, especially in WWF, you would ever get judges in matches. So that was quite cool to see being played out in front of us. And this first match lasted just over 5 minutes. It was a pretty basic heel versus babyface encounter. Of course, Lee Wong being the jobber ends up losing to Blackjack Lanza in pretty comfortable fashion. It was a fine match. Lanza sort of generally went for sort of headlocks, chokeholds, that sort of thing. The ring announcer couldn't say his name, thought it was Blackjack Lanza. And yeah, no, it was a fine match. In the end, he wins by chokehold, does Lanza. This is still a couple of years, as I say, before they win the tag titles, so you can expect them to start building towards that fairly soon. As the Blackjacks, well, they were both excellent, really, and Lanza in this match was fine. There were a little bit of eye raking going on, And I'll touch on eye raking a little bit more later and how it played out and specifically cheating. And there were all sorts of crazy things that Lanza did, including raking Lee Wong's eyes with his shoe. And in the end, he wins after getting the claw hold in. And just as Vince on commentary says, "Yes, I believe Lee Wong is motionless now," Lee Wong starts shaking his arm about 2 seconds before the referee calls for the bell. Claws for the bell? Calls for the bell. Excuse me. And so this match finishes, and I've given it 1 star. It was what it was. It did the job. Nobody messed up anything too badly. Everything was fine. Enjoyed it. I very much enjoyed it. 1 star for Lee Wong versus Blackjack Lanza. As we move on to match number 2. Now then, this match was a bit different. It was Professor Toru Tanaka, accompanied by the Grand Wizards, against the sensational El Olympico from Mexico. And as Professor Toru Tanaka makes his way to the ring, Vince McMahon calls him a solid block of granite. Yeah, that's what we've come to expect, isn't it? And El Olympico comes down. I don't know if he was supposed to be a luchador or not, or what the deal was with him. But he's not wearing a mask. But he's wearing a thing. But it's also not like the thing that they wear in amateur wrestling either. It's something in between them. It's like a swimming cap with a chin strap at the bottom, like a scrum cap that they wear in rugby, but it's made out of lycra that he would wear as tights. It's very strange what he's wearing on his head, El Olympico. It's like a luchador mask with no face covering, which defies the point of a mask. The definition of a mask is to cover your face, and it didn't. It was very weird. Anyway, and I'm not convinced he was Mexican. So as the match starts, and it starts off. It doesn't really start, if I'm being honest, for a little while, because as Toru Tanaka is doing the classic Japanese ritual involving the salt and throwing it into the corner and this, that, and the other. There was a lady an older lady, and when I first watched this show, I thought, well, maybe she's some sort of celebrity, because Vince said one of the more distinguished women around today is what he called her, and name-dropped her as Mrs. Krieger. So I thought I'd go online, have a little search. She wasn't a celebrity per se, but she was certainly famous for turning up at these shows at around this time, and getting involved in matches every now and then, trying to help foil the heels for the babyfaces, because, of course, at this point in time, there are no guardrails, none of that. And her name, I forget her name now. I will have to check that out and edit it later. And I found this brilliant article talking about how many shows she went to and how dedicated she was. And in fact, there was even a whole wrestling card that was called the Mrs. Krieger Appreciation Evening or something in the mid-70s. It really was. She sort of she very much encapsulated sort of the classic, especially over here in Britain, the classic image of the grannies hitting the heels with the handbags. And anyway, so as Tanaka's throwing this salt onto the ground, she's wiping it away out of the ring as he's throwing it onto the ring canvas to start the match, and she's sort of throwing a bum in his face. It's very funny from the outside of the ring, and no one's really doing anything because she's not technically interfering. She's not getting in the ring. She's just a little old lady just having a bit of fun, and so yeah, this match takes place, and it's okay. It is what it is. So it's sort of what Vince calls it is chasing the evil spirits away, what Mrs. Krieger was doing, but it starts off pretty easily. El Olympico gets a side headlock in. He gets sent into the ropes. There's a couple of leg holds for both guys before Toru Tanaka, for several minutes, applies what I can only describe as a titty clamp. He just grabs hold of El Olympico's sort of breast areas and just grips them hard. And what's called in England, in playgrounds in the UK, it's called a nipple cripple, that sort of move. And it wasn't the last time it would make an appearance on this show, as we will see. And the match continues. It's Olympico escapes, and here's the first thing I noticed. He stamps on Tanaka's bare foot. Now, is this cheating? Not really. Tanaka shouldn't have bare feet in a wrestling ring, should he? But there's a moment a couple of seconds later when he puts his finger in the ear of Tanaka to escape a wrist lock. And he's the babyface, and he's getting cheered for this. And it wasn't the first example on this show that we'll see of the babyface cheating and acting like a bit of a dick in order to, stay in the match against the heel. And the fans bought it and cheered for him. It was very strange. But then again, I suppose if you're invested in the characters, then you're eager to see Tanaka get his ass kicked. And the crowd was hot for this match, to be fair to them. They enjoyed El Olympico. And he dodges a Tanaka dodges a senton before eating a dropkick. But eventually, he no-sells that and gets a Kimura in. And he keeps that in for a little while before Olympico fires up, hits a snapmare, head scissors, and then finishes it off with a dropkick. Goes into a near fall, and it's a strange near fall because the cover is so weak. It's no surprise Tanaka kicked out at one. He was barely even touching the guy. The match continues. Eventually, you get to a corner kick and a headlock punch for another dropkick and another near fall for El Olympico. He's absolutely rolling. Gets sent into the ropes. Tanaka sent into the ropes. Comes in, goes down, hits a judo chop similar to Goldust's, thrust punch, and then just stacks him up for the three. A pretty underwhelming end to a half decent match. I went for another 1-star rating for it. It was what it was. I enjoyed it. It was fun. And Toru Tanaka, I'm not sure. I'll have to double check whether or not he was one half of the World Tag Team Champions at the time. But if he was, along with Mr. Fuji, then it seems strange that he wasn't carrying the belt and wasn't announced as it. But I believe they said Mr. Fuji was one half of the World Tag Team Champions. So I'll double check that now. But yeah, no, a fine match. And first 2 matches on the card, and the heels are going over. It's a good day to be a bad guy, apparently. Alright, well, having said that, we move into one of my favourite matches on the card. Captain Lou Albano, who's starting to wind down as a wrestler, and he's thoroughly enjoying a stint now as a manager. He's a very entertaining manager. He was up against Gorilla Monsoon in a grudge match, a special attraction match as it was called by the ring announcer. And as they come out, Gorilla Monsoon. This is the first time I've ever seen a Gorilla Monsoon match. I really, really enjoyed it. In terms of how over he was, and to see how big a star he really was. Because this is now, in 1973, it's when he's turned babyface, but I'm trying to think of how to describe it. We're currently in sort of the period when he's getting over. He's not the most over he'll ever be, and the place is going nuts for him. So in maybe like a month's time, when we're looking at shows from 1977, 78, when he's one of the biggest baby faces in the company, I can barely even imagine how over he was then. Because looking at this show up and down, he was the most over guy on the show, in my opinion. And so he gets in the ring, and this is just a squash match, really. Lou Albano's giving it the big I am before the match starts. He's wearing a jacket with his name on it. He's really dolled up for the occasion. Gorilla Monsoon comes down and he looks big. I didn't realise how big Gorilla Monsoon is, but he was a large gentleman. And so the match begins. It's a very standard squash match. Lou Albano gets a couple of little eye rakes in. The crowd's booing, and Gorilla eventually after the third one just says, "Fuck this," takes it home, and it was very, very fun, I have to say. Lou was flying all over the place for Gorilla, gets thrown out of the ring, or he gets punched out of the ring and then just runs to the back. And Gorilla, the effective winner there. You can only assume by count out. A nice, fun, easy squash match. I haven't given it a star rating, but I think, on balance, I'd give this 2 stars. I really enjoyed this. And so next we come to Black Gordman versus Victor Rivera. I didn't realise that this match happened, because I've seen a little bit of Victor Rivera before, and from the way that he worked, he seemed to be fairly ahead of his time. He was capable of getting a decent match out of anybody, and he was surprisingly athletic as well. I thoroughly enjoyed this match. For me, this is one of my favourite matches on the show. It was a solid mid-card match between 2 guys that weren't really going anywhere. But that doesn't change the fact that they both worked very, very hard. And so Victor begins with a couple of quick arm drags, a little cartwheel to show off, hell yeah, I'm an athlete, me. And Gordman begins to plead with Victor, please no, don't do it. Eventually a couple of strong Irish whips, which were fairly well sold, give Gordman the advantage, and he applies a heel hold. This match I enjoyed. There was a surfboard which got reversed. That got a big reaction. There was some eye raking going on from Gordman to get the heat. Gets a sleep hold on. Victor escaped it really nicely. Got his comeback in, a couple of drop kicks, a couple of head scissors. But eventually Gordman gets the heat back with a side headlock. But then Victor no-sells a shoulder tackle. Victor didn't no-sell the shoulder tackle. My notes are a bit dodgy sometimes. It was Black Gordman that no-sold the shoulder tackle. Did a body slam. Victor got up immediately, having no-sold that, and then just got him in a small package and won. This was a nice little match, about 10 minutes long. And the crowd popped for Victor winning. A surprisingly over babyface, considering that he was black in the early 1970s. Although this is, I suppose, in the north of America, where things were a little bit different to in the south, which I think is a fair statement to make. But yeah, I went 2 stars again for this match. I really enjoyed it. Good fun, a nice pace throughout, and Victor Rivera, an athletic worker that, as we'll see next week, is capable of having good matches with multiple opponents. And so then we come to the lady wrestling. This was not good. As a totality, it was a tag team match between Dottie Downs and Peggy Patterson against Jan Sheridan and Joyce Grable. Jan and Joyce, the skinny blonde babyfaces, against Dottie and Peggy, the blobby, fat, old hag heels. And that was how it was billed. It was a 2 out of 3 falls match, and that was really what killed it, because it meant it went somewhere around the 20-25 minute mark, and that was far too long for this match. But I mean, Dottie and Peggy were good sort of mean workers, and Jan and Joyce were good baby faces, good at getting the sympathy in. What I did find funny was some of Vince McMahon's lines that he had, especially at the start of this match, when he described it obviously as the lady wrestling. And he goes, I'm sure the referee will have no objection to patting these ladies down. And he says, he's taking a while explaining the rules. Maybe he's lining a date up for himself. Although I doubt it would be with Dottie or Peggy. Which I did find funny. As the match begins, he describes Jan Sheridan as being full of spunk. These are all quotes which are really quite problematic in 2019. But obviously it's a symptom of the times, and that's, it is what it is. And the match begins. There's just a ton of wolf whistling. Peggy and Jan start the match. It's pretty even, if poorly sold. There are a few really stiff shots in there, some from Jan, but mostly from Peggy or Dottie throughout the match. There were some really, they went for each other with some really hard-looking forearms and clotheslines and slaps and things. Anyway, the first fall went to... My God, this match, really wasn't good. I can't remember the order of the falls. First fall... I'll be honest. It went to, I believe, Jan and Joyce. Joyce got the first fall on Dottie, and my notes at one point have just said boring here, because it dragged. The first fall took too long to get to. But what you got to bear in mind is at this point in time, it's a bit different. We know that nothing's going to count until the first 2 falls are done, but at this point in time, obviously they don't. So the crowd stays fairly hot. I mean, there were points when they would die a bit, and they did die a bit in the middle, but once the first fall was scored, the crowd was fairly hot until the finish. The second fall came with a roll-up, I believe. Can't quite remember. Anyway, it was 1-1, and Joyce got tagged in, and the finish, which is about the only thing you need to really, that's worth looking at, is when Jan manages to get Dottie, or Dottie gets Jan on her shoulders in an electric chair position, and Jan just rolls all the way through in what's really quite a new school move. It's the Juice Robinson Kenny Omega finish. That's what I call it. From the electric chair position, is able to roll through, roll her up, and gets the 3. And Jan and Joyce won. It was really not very good. I gave it -1 star. It wasn't unbearably unwatchable, because at least, the storytelling was there and people were trying, but it just went too long and it really dragged, and the interest levels of me, of the viewers, and of the audience in the arena certainly seemed to go downhill for this match after the novelty of having ladies in the ring in skimpy outfits wrestling had faded away. They seemed to die a little bit of a death. So yeah, I went -1 star. Worst match of the show, and it was right in the middle of the show, in between the Victor Rivera match and the title match, and it just took a lot out of you. I understand why it was there. It was nicely placed to sort of, I suppose, calm the crowd before the final couple of matches, and in that regard, it did its job. But not a fan. Hope the lady wrestling improves. And so next, it's surprisingly early. George the Animal Steel challenging Pedro Morales for the WWWF Championship. Not the main event. That really, really surprised me, to be quite honest. Because there's 2 matches after this. 2 matches. It wasn't even the semi-main event. It was a third match from the top. And that did surprise me, especially when I saw how over Pedro was. It wasn't as though he was, some sort of failing champion in terms of popularity. They'd never have put the belt on him if he wasn't super popular. It very much surprised me that this match was on here, and the show was main evented by something quite different. But the match itself was really good. I thoroughly enjoyed it, to be honest. George Steele was hated by this crowd, and he played up to that perfectly. Pedro starts the match by running wild, sends a strong Irish whip, and a scoop slam, and some stomping. Eventually, George Steele has to run to the outside, and he stays out there for a little while to reassess and regroup. That's the word I'm looking for. That's the classic line, isn't it? Reassess and regroup. You hear that every week on Raw. Bloody Michael Cole. And so gets back in the ring, and immediately Steele regains the advantage with some shots to the ring post. That's how he sort of gets the upper hand and gets the heat in the match. Eventually Pedro's able to turn it around, hits an arm drag, sends George's head into the steel post, and I'm not sure if George Steele bladed or if it was hard way, but he did start bleeding in this match. And yeah, no, this was a fun little match. Eventually, after Steele's bladed, he gets sent into the corner and gets him in a headlock. Pedro gets Steele in a headlock and is just going to town on his head, and the ref calls for the stoppage. Victory for Pedro Morales, who retains the WWWF Championship via a stoppage in just over 8 minutes in a decent match, a very decent match. There's only 6 months left of Pedro Morales as the champion. Because this show is in June, he drops the title, I believe, by November, so he's coming into the back end of his reign, which I believe was around a year or so as champion before he drops it to Stan Stasiak, and then the next time we do actually watch isn't until 1975, when Bruno Sammartino is back on top of the tree, and we get to watch Bruno for the first time. But yeah, I have to say, this match, I enjoyed Pedro, and as they leave the ring, as Steele tries to attack him after the bell, Pedro knocks him away a couple more times. Steele runs to the back, and Pedro celebrates with the Puerto Rican flag, the American flag. He was really, really, really popular, and shaking hands with all the people at ringside. So a fun match. Pedro Morales retains the championship, and looking forward to seeing, hopefully, a little bit more out of him. However, I'm not sure. That might be the last time we see him. I'll have to double check that. And now we come on to the semi-main event. It was Jay Strongbow against Mr. Fuji. Good old Mr. Fuji. I've done a little bit of checking, and it turns out they weren't the tag team champions at the time. That was Haystacks Calhoun and Tony Gurria. However, they did win the titles about a month and a half after this show finished. It was in mid-September that they won the championships, in this show at the end of June. So it was Mr. Fuji and Tanaka that won the titles. So how they got there, we'll never know, I suppose. And guess who's back at ringside? Good old Mrs. Krieger. I found her name. It's Georgette Krieger. Georgette Krieger. She was back to wipe away the salt that Mr. Fuji would put down in the corner of the ring. And this was a fun match. I have to say, I'd never seen Jay Strongbow before, and he did probably the most athletic move of the entire show. He hadn't been with the company for more than about a year or so. Going into this match, he was still trying to get over his babyface. It didn't take him much longer than 2 years. And he did this move. Mr. Fuji was on the apron, looking into the ring. Jay Strongbow sort of grabs the rope with his right arm, lifts his legs up, grabs Fuji and head scissors him into the ring. It was a really cool move, and it's something that you don't actually see many people doing nowadays. I'm not too sure why that is, because it looked really cool as Mr. Fuji kind of did a flip bump into the ring. Strongbow did the head scissors. It was a nice move. He did it twice in a row from both sides. Eventually there's some arm drags. Then they start running the ropes. The old running the ropes spot. Vince McMahon goes, "Where will they stop? Nobody knows." It's that classic spot. Mr. Fuji rakes the eyes to try and get the heat. Goes to the top rope, but it doesn't work. Gets thrown off. And then a big scoop slam from Chief Jay Strongbow. and again, the babyface cheating because because Strongbow uses Mr. Fuji's salt to throw it in Mr. Fuji's eyes. I didn't like that. Why are these babyfaces all being such dicks to the heels? It makes no sense. Why? And this guy hadn't even been with the company very long. He risked getting himself a little bit booed there, but it didn't happen. The crowd was thoroughly behind Chief Jay Strongbow, and as he goes around the ring, he's doing his little dances, his funny kind of walk. You can hear all the people in the crowd doing the old Indian high-pitched chant, the old that one. And so eventually I don't know if it was if this was part of their gimmick, but for the second time this evening, we see the nipple clamp applied by Mr. Fuji, just as it was applied by Professor Tanaka earlier on in the evening. And eventually Strongbow escapes, gets some chops in, goes to Irish whip, but gets pulled down. I think I've got that very wrong. Hold on a minute, let me read my notes again. That's right, he goes for an Irish whip. No, I'll get this right. He does an Irish whip, gets pulled down, and starts getting punched on. That's Strongbow's getting punched on. But for some reason, Fuji leaves him too long, hits the ropes, and gets struck with the double tomahawk chop. Sorry, let me just put my tea down. Let me just move back a bit. Tomahawk chop! Oh no, I'm rolling over stuff in my roller chair. And he got the win. Nice win for Chief Jay Strongbow. I gave that match 1 star. Oh, I also forgot to mention I gave the Pedro match, I gave that 2 stars. So I gave this match 1 star. It was fun, it was fine. And, I can understand, looking at the way that he worked, and he was quite charismatic, it's easy to see how Jay Strongbow got himself over. And that's important to note, because he actually plays a crucial role in the next championship match that we will see next week, when Bruno Sammartino is defending the title. He plays a role in that story that we'll go into at the time. And so, Chief Jay Strongbow getting the win over Mr. Fuji. So I suppose Mr. Fuji and Toru Tanaka are 1-1 for the evening as a team. And on we go to the main event. And so we move on to the main event. Moondog Mayne, the big fat hippie, against good old Haystacks Calhoun. Bit of an American rip-off of the Giant Haystacks, if you ask me, but who am I to judge, I suppose. And this was a fun match, it was fine. It was just 2 big lugs kind of going at it with some big kicks and holds and stomps in the corner. I didn't mind it. It was obviously it was poor and very, very unathletic. If any of you have seen Haystacks Calhoun, you'll know exactly why it's quite unathletic. And predictably, Calhoun gets the win to send the crowd home happy with a great big splash. And yeah, I gave this match only half a star. It wasn't great. It was what it was. It was two big lugs having a very unathletic sort of match. But I can't be too critical because it is what it is. And that was the theme throughout the show. Matches that I wouldn't necessarily like if I saw them in the modern sort of era, but considering the time frame that we're looking at, we've got to put them into the context of everything going on. And they were decent, really, and entertaining. And that is the main thing, that it entertained, and it did that supremely well. I was a fan of most of the matches on the show, barring one or two, and throughout it entertained, nothing hugely above 2 stars. Enjoyable, entertaining, that's the point I keep coming back to, because it's going to be a crucial point. Because wrestling can entertain you in more than one way. It doesn't just have to be, the flippy stuff or the 30-minute classics. It's just a bad guy versus a good guy, and good fun old wrestling, and I love it. And so I've given this show 1 star because there is a lot of room for improvement in terms of the match quality. But with all that said, I was entertained, and I hope that's the theme throughout. And I certainly hope that you were entertained listening to the podcast today. I'll hope to see you this time next week, all being well, and speak to you again after a while. Please feel free to drop a like. Feel free to subscribe. As I say, new videos and new podcasts hopefully coming every single week. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll speak to you again soon.